Welcome, Nightmare Society members, to the forgotten corners of America. Those places where the highways narrow, the cell towers grow sparse, and the welcome signs promise hospitality that comes with a price you never agreed to pay. I'm your host, and tonight we're taking a journey through 5 small communities where the American dream has curdled into something far more sinister. These are stories about the places we pass through on our way to somewhere else, never suspecting that behind those white picket fences and friendly waves lurk secrets that have been festering for generations. You see, there's something uniquely terrifying about small-town horror. In the city, danger can come from anywhere. A stranger in a crowd, a dark alley, a random act of violence. But in small towns, the horror is intimate, personal. It comes from the very people who should protect you, your neighbors, your teachers, and your local officials. It comes from the community itself, turned predator. Tonight, you'll meet newcomers who thought they'd found sanctuary, only to discover they'd stumbled into carefully laid traps. You'll witness the dark traditions that small communities will kill to preserve. You'll see how isolation and insularity can transform ordinary people into something monstrous, and how the most welcoming smiles can hide the hungriest teeth. So, settle in, lock your doors, and remember, the next time you find yourself driving through a town where everyone seems just a little too eager to make you feel at home, you might want to keep driving, because some communities have appetites that can only be satisfied by those foolish enough to stop and stay. Our first story takes us to a late-night diner where the customer is always right, and sometimes becomes the main course. Story 1. The last customer, Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the key in the lock of Millfield's only diner. The closed sign swayed gently in the October wind, casting shifting shadows across the cracked parking lot. She'd been working the night shift at Murphy's Diner for 3 months now, ever since moving to this sleepy town of barely 800 souls, and she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The townspeople were friendly enough during the day, maybe too friendly, with their constant questions about where she'd come from and whether she planned to stay. But once the sun went down, Millfield transformed. Streets emptied by 8 p.m., porch lights flickered on like a coordinated signal, and an oppressive silence settled over everything like a heavy blanket. Sarah flipped on the fluorescent lights, their harsh buzz filling the empty diner. The checkered linoleum floor gleamed under the artificial glow, and the red vinyl booths sat empty, waiting for the handful of late-night regulars who would drift in over the next few hours. There was old Pete, who ordered black coffee and apple pie at exactly 11:30 every night. Mrs. Henderson, who came in at midnight for chamomile tea and always sat in booth 7. And then there was the stranger. He'd started coming in about 2 weeks ago, always arriving just before closing time at 2 a.m. Tall and gaunt, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He never ordered food, just sat in the corner booth nursing a cup of coffee that grew cold while he watched Sarah work. When she'd tried to make conversation, he'd only smiled, a thin, humorless expression that made her skin crawl. The worst part was what Pete had told her about him. That fella's been coming round for years, the old man had whispered one night, glancing nervously at the stranger's booth. Every time we get a new night girl, he shows up, sits there watching, waiting. Then, Pete had trailed off, shaking his head. Well, let's just say we go through a lot of night shift workers. Sarah tried to push the memory from her mind as she went through her opening routine. She started the coffee machines, checked the pie display, and restocked the sugar dispensers. The familiar tasks usually calmed her nerves, but tonight felt different. The air itself seemed charged with malevolent energy, and every shadow in her peripheral vision looked like it might be moving. At 10:47 p.m., the bell above the door chimed, and Pete shuffled in right on schedule. He was a fixture in Millfield, had been born here 73 years ago and never left. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors, and his hands shook slightly as he hung his coat on the hook. By the door. "Evening, Sarah," he said, settling into his usual booth. "Coffee and pie, like always." She poured his coffee and cut a generous slice of apple pie, noticing how his eyes kept darting to the windows. "Everything okay, Pete? You seem nervous." He accepted the plate with hands that trembled more than usual. "It's October 31st, he said quietly. "Halloween, this town takes Halloween real serious." "What do you mean?" Pete took a sip of coffee, his pale blue eyes meeting hers over the rim of the cup. "Every year, on Halloween night, someone in Millfield goes missing. Always someone new, someone who don't belong. We tell ourselves they just moved on, found better opportunities elsewhere. But deep down, we all know the truth." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Pete, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That stranger who's been coming in, he ain't human. None of us know what he is exactly, but we know what he does. He marks his prey, watches them, learns their routines. And on Halloween night..." The bell chimed again, cutting Pete off mid-sentence. Mrs. Henderson entered, her usual punctual self, but she looked pale and drawn. She nodded curtly at Pete and Sarah before sliding into booth 7, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Just tea tonight, dear," she said when Sarah approached. Her voice was barely above a whisper. As Sarah prepared the chamomile tea, she noticed both Pete and Mrs. Henderson kept glancing at the clock. It was 12:15 a.m. Halloween was officially here. The diner suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and the fluorescent lights seemed to dim despite no change in the controls. At 1:30 a.m. the stranger arrived. The door opened without the bell chiming, which should have been impossible. He simply materialized in the doorway like a shadow given form, his tall frame blocking out the dim light from the parking lot. Pete immediately looked down at his coffee cup, and Mrs. Henderson actually shuddered. "Evening," the stranger said, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. He moved with an unnatural fluidity, seeming to glide rather than walk as he made his way to the corner booth. Up close, Sarah could see that his skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and his fingernails were too long and too sharp. "Coffee?" she managed to ask, her voice catching in her throat. He smiled that horrible smile. "Of course. Black, like always." Sarah's hands shook as she poured the coffee. The stranger's eyes never left her face, and she could feel his gaze like ice water in her veins. When she set the cup down, his fingers brushed against hers. His skin was cold as winter earth. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been looking forward to this night for quite some time. There's something special about Halloween in small towns like this. The veil between worlds grows thin, and all sorts of opportunities present themselves." Pete stood abruptly, throwing money on the table. "I should be getting home," he mumbled, not looking at anyone. Mrs. Henderson followed suit, leaving her tea barely touched. Within minutes, Sarah was alone with the stranger. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the tick of the wall clock. The stranger sipped his coffee with deliberate slowness, savoring each drop while never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Scared, are we?" he asked after what felt like hours. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah lied, wiping down the counter for the third time. "Of course you do. Fear is written all over your face. It's quite intoxicating, actually. The scent of it, the taste of it in the air. I've been sampling it for weeks now, letting it build and mature like a fine wine." Sarah's hand found the handle of a knife in the knife block. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but..." "Game?" The stranger threw back his head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear girl, this is no game. This is tradition. This is sustenance. This is what keeps the balance in little towns like Millfield." He stood, and Sarah realized with horror that he was even taller than she'd thought, at least 7 feet, with limbs that seemed too long for his frame. His shadow stretched across the entire diner, swallowing the weak light. "You see, every community needs its predator. Every ecosystem requires something at the top of the food chain. The people of Millfield understand this. They accept it. They even facilitate it, in their own small way." "That's insane," Sarah whispered, backing toward the kitchen. "Is it? Think about it. They hired you for this shift specifically. They told you just enough to keep you here. but not enough to make you run. They've been feeding you to me, bit by bit, night after night. Your fear, your loneliness, your growing desperation. It's all been seasoning for tonight's feast. The stranger began to change as he spoke. His human facade melted away like wax, revealing something ancient and hungry underneath. His skin became mottled and gray, his fingers extended into claws, and his eyes turned completely black. When he smiled now, Sarah could see row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. "What are you?" she gasped. "I am what lurks at the edges of small-town life. I am the reason people lock their doors at night. The shadow that makes children walk faster past empty lots. I am the price this community pays for its peace and prosperity. One life, freely given, every year." Sarah ran for the kitchen, but the stranger was faster. He moved like liquid darkness, blocking her path before she'd taken 3 steps. His claws wrapped around her throat, not quite tight enough to cut off her air, but cold as ice against her skin. "The beauty of small towns," he whispered in her ear, "is that everyone knows when someone doesn't belong. You were marked the moment you arrived, my dear. The diner job, this shift, even your apartment, it was all arranged. The good people of Millfield may not like what I am, but they understand what I need." Sarah's vision began to blur as the stranger's grip tightened. She could taste copper in her mouth and feel her strength ebbing away. But just as consciousness started to slip, she heard something that made her heart leap. The distant sound of a car engine. The stranger heard it too and loosened his grip slightly. Through the diner windows, Sarah could see headlights approaching. A police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, and Sheriff Davis stepped out, his hand resting on his weapon. "Well, well," the stranger mused. "It seems we have a complication." "Sheriff." Davis entered the diner, his eyes immediately taking in the scene. Sarah expected him to draw his gun, to shout orders, to help her. Instead, he simply nodded at the stranger. "Evening, Samuel," the sheriff said calmly. "Running a bit late tonight, aren't you?" "Samuel?" Sarah croaked. The creature that had called itself the stranger straightened, resuming something closer to human form. "Sheriff Davis, I was just concluding my business here." "Afraid there's been a change of plans," the sheriff said, consulting his watch. "Council met earlier tonight. We've decided to alter the arrangement." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they were going to save her after all. "You see, Sarah," Sheriff Davis continued, "we've grown quite fond of you these past few months. You're a hard worker, polite, and you make excellent coffee. The council decided we'd rather keep you around." The hope died in her chest. "Then who?" Sheriff Davis smiled, but it was the same cold, predatory expression she'd seen on the stranger's face. "Well, that's the beauty of small towns. There's always someone new coming through, someone who won't be missed." On cue, the diner door opened again. A young man in his 20s stumbled in, clearly exhausted and probably lost. He wore a college sweatshirt and carried a backpack, the epitome of a traveler just passing through. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Sarah, "but do you know if there's a motel around here? My car broke down about a mile up the road." Sarah tried to speak to warn him, but the stranger's grip tightened again. She could only watch in horror as Sheriff Davis approached the young man with his most welcoming smile. "Why, of course, son. Matter of fact, there's a nice place just down the road, but it's awful late to be checking in. Why don't you have some coffee first? Warm up a bit." The young man looked around the diner, taking in the scene. Sarah pinned by what he probably assumed was her boyfriend. The sheriff being helpful, everything appearing normal. "That sounds great, actually. It's been a long drive." As the young man settled into a booth, Sheriff Davis caught Sarah's eye and shook his head slowly. The message was clear. Any attempt to warn him would result in both their deaths. The stranger, Samuel, released her throat and returned to his booth as if nothing had happened. "Coffee for our new friend," he called out pleasantly, "and perhaps a slice of that delicious apple pie." Sarah's hands moved mechanically, pouring coffee and cutting pie while her mind raced. The young man chatted amiably with Sheriff Davis about his travels, his plans, his life. With each detail he shared, Sarah saw the predatory gleam grow brighter in Samuel's eyes. As the clock approached 2 a.m., Sarah realized with growing horror that this was how it worked. This was how Millfield survived. They found someone expendable, someone passing through, someone who wouldn't be missed. They fed them to the monster, and in return, the monster left the rest of the town alone. The young man finished his coffee and pie, thanking Sarah profusely for her kindness. Sheriff Davis offered to give him a ride to his car, and even Samuel waved goodbye with seemingly genuine warmth. As they left together, Sarah sank to her knees behind the counter. She was alive, but at what cost? She was now complicit in what was about to happen. She was part of the machine that fed the monster. The next morning, Sheriff Davis would file a report about an abandoned car found on the highway. The young man would be listed as a missing person who had simply disappeared somewhere between here and there. And life in Millfield would continue as it always had. Sarah understood now why the previous night shift workers had left so suddenly. Not because Samuel had taken them, but because they couldn't live with the knowledge of what they'd become part of. She stared at the empty diner, at the booth where the young man had sat so trustingly, and wondered if she had the strength to stay, or if she too would disappear into the night, leaving Millfield to find another lamb for the slaughter. Outside, dawn was breaking over the small town. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the church bells calling the faithful to morning service. The good people of Millfield would pray for their souls and give thanks for another year of peace and prosperity, and they would never speak of the price they paid for it. Story 2. The Welcome Committee. The moving truck pulled away from 47 Maple Street just as the sun began its descent behind the elm trees that lined the quiet neighborhood. Emma Rodriguez stood on her new front porch, keys still warm in her palm, and surveyed the street that would be her home for the foreseeable future. Willowbrook seemed like the perfect place to start fresh after her divorce. Affordable housing, good schools for her 8-year-old daughter Maya, and the kind of small-town charm that city life had somehow never provided. The houses on Maple Street were modest but well-maintained, each with its own small lawn and white picket fence. She could see children's bicycles propped against garage doors and flower gardens that spoke of residents who took pride in their community. It was exactly what she'd been hoping for when she'd answered the job posting for a librarian position at Willowbrook Elementary. "Mom, can we order pizza tonight?" Maya called from inside the house, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Sure, sweetheart. Let me just check if there are any delivery places around here." Emma pulled out her phone to search for local restaurants when she noticed a small group of neighbors approaching from down the street. 3 women and 2 men, all carrying covered dishes and wearing identical warm smiles. The woman leading the group was in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of coordinated outfit that suggested she'd never met a clothing store she didn't like. She extended a manicured hand as the group reached Emma's front gate. "You must be Emma." "I'm Carol Henley, president of the Willowbrook Neighborhood Association. We wanted to welcome you and your daughter to our little community." The other neighbors introduced themselves in turn. Janet, a thin woman with nervous energy who kept adjusting her glasses. Bob, a heavy-set man with kind eyes who ran the local hardware store. Susan, a younger woman with twins of her own. And Frank, an elderly gentleman who'd apparently lived on Maple Street since the 1960s. "This is so thoughtful," Emma said, accepting a casserole dish from Janet. "Maya and I were just talking about dinner." "Oh, we always take care of our new neighbors," Carol said, her smile never wavering. "Willowbrook is a very special place. We all look out for each other here." The group followed Emma into her house, and she was struck by how they moved as a unit, like they'd done this many times before. They set their dishes on her kitchen counter while cooing over the moving boxes and asking the usual questions about where she'd come from and what had brought her to their town. Maya appeared from upstairs, curious about the voices, and the neighbors immediately showered her with attention. Susan mentioned that her twins were around Maya's age and would love to have a playmate. Frank offered to show her the best climbing tree in the neighborhood. Everyone seemed genuinely delighted to have them there. "Now," Carol said, producing a thick binder from her oversized purse. "I know you're probably tired from the move, but I wanted to go over a few things about living in our neighborhood. Just some guidelines to help everyone get along." Emma accepted the binder, surprised by its weight. The cover read, Willowbrook Neighborhood Association Guidelines and Community Standards, in embossed gold lettering. Guidelines? Emma flipped through the pages, noting that the binder was at least 50 pages thick. Oh, nothing too complicated, Carol assured her. Just things like lawn maintenance schedules, quiet hours, approved paint colors for exterior touch-ups. You know, the basics that keep property values up and everyone happy. Bob chimed in. There's also information about our community meetings. We gather every month to discuss neighborhood business. Attendance is, well, let's just say we hope everyone can make it. It's mandatory, Frank said bluntly, earning sharp looks from the others. What? She'll find out anyway. Carol's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. What Frank means is that we've found community participation really helps everyone feel connected. We're like one big family here. Emma nodded, though something about the way they spoke made her slightly uncomfortable. There was an underlying intensity to their friendliness, as if her acceptance of their guidelines wasn't really optional. There's also the matter of the community fund, Janet said, speaking for the first time since the introductions. Each household contributes $50 monthly for neighborhood improvements and activities. Activities? Community events, Susan explained quickly. The annual block party, holiday decorations, maintenance of our little park, that sort of thing. Speaking of which, Carol said, consulting an expensive-looking watch, we should probably let you get settled, but Emma, I do hope you'll consider joining us for coffee tomorrow morning. Say, 9 o'clock? I'd love to introduce you to some of the other ladies in the neighborhood. It wasn't really phrased as a question, Emma noticed. Before she could respond, the group was filing out her front door, calling out cheerful goodbyes and reminding her about the coffee date. What nice people, Maya said, already investigating the covered dishes they'd left behind. Yeah, Emma agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been slightly off about the encounter. Maybe it was just culture shock. She was used to city anonymity, not small-town involvement. That night, after they'd eaten Janet's excellent lasagna and Carol's homemade rolls, Emma sat down with the neighborhood guidelines binder while Maya watched cartoons. What she read made her increasingly uneasy. The guidelines weren't suggestions, they were rules. Strict rules about everything from when residents could mow their lawns, Saturdays between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. only, to what types of vehicles could be parked in driveways. No commercial vehicles, no motorcycles, no cars older than 10 years. There were regulations about pet ownership, garden plants, outdoor decorations, and even what color curtains were acceptable for front-facing windows. More troubling were the sections about community obligations. Monthly meetings weren't just encouraged. They were required, with a system of fines for absences that weren't pre-approved by the association board. There were mandatory volunteer hours for neighborhood beautification projects. And there was an entire section about maintaining community standards that seemed to give the association authority to inspect properties and levy fines for violations. The final section, titled Community Security and Safety, made Emma's blood run cold. It outlined a neighborhood watch program that sounded more like surveillance than safety. Residents were expected to report any unusual activity by their neighbors, including visitors who stayed longer than 3 days, packages delivered at odd hours, or changes in daily routines that might indicate antisocial behavior. Emma closed the binder, telling herself she was overreacting. So, what if they were a little intense about community standards? It was probably just old-fashioned small-town life. She'd grown up in apartments where she didn't even know her neighbors' names. Maybe this was just how functional communities operated. The next morning, she dropped Maya off at school and walked the 3 blocks to Carol's house for coffee. The Tudor-style home was immaculate, from its perfectly manicured garden to its spotless windows. Carol answered the door in another coordinated outfit, this one in shades of cream and beige. Emma, right on time. I do appreciate punctuality. The living room was filled with 8 other women, all of whom had apparently been waiting for Emma's arrival. They sat in a perfect circle, teacups balanced on matching saucers, looking like a Norman Rockwell painting of suburban domesticity. Ladies, I'd like you to meet Emma Rodriguez, our newest neighbor, Carol announced. Emma, these are the wives of Maple Street. As Emma was introduced to each woman, she noticed they all had the same carefully maintained appearance, styled. Hair, coordinated outfits, bright smiles that never quite reached their eyes. They asked the same questions she'd heard yesterday. Where was she from? What had brought her to Willowbrook? Was she planning to stay long term? Now, Emma, Carol said once the initial pleasantries were over, I wanted to talk to you about getting more involved in our community. We have several committees that could use your expertise. Committees. The Beautification Committee oversees all landscaping and exterior maintenance standards, explained a woman named Patricia. The Safety Committee coordinates our Neighborhood Watch program. The Social Committee plans our community events, and the Standards Committee ensures everyone is following the guidelines. We'd love to have you join the Standards Committee, Carol said. With your background in education, you'd be perfect for helping ensure our community maintains its quality. Emma sipped her coffee, which was excellent, while trying to process what she was hearing. What exactly does the Standards Committee do? The women exchanged glances before Carol answered. We monitor compliance with community guidelines, conduct property inspections, address violations, help neighbors understand their obligations. You mean like policing each other? Not policing, said a woman named Ruth quickly. More like guidance. We're all in this together after all. When everyone follows the same standards, everyone benefits. Patricia leaned forward conspiratorially. Between you and me, some of the newer residents need a little extra attention. People come here from the city thinking they can do whatever they want. We help them understand how things work in Willowbrook. What happens if someone doesn't want to follow the guidelines? The silence that followed Emma's question was telling. The women looked at each other with expressions she couldn't quite read. Well, Carol said finally, that's really not an issue here. Everyone wants to be part of the community. That's why they moved to Maple Street. But hypothetically, Emma, Carol interrupted, her smile never wavering but her tone turning slightly cooler. I think you're overthinking this. We're just neighbors helping neighbors. Nothing more complicated than that. The coffee gathering ended shortly after, with each woman hugging Emma goodbye and expressing how excited they were to have her in the neighborhood. But as Emma walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just been interviewed for a job she didn't remember applying for. That afternoon, Maya came home from school with her own news about their new community. Mom, some of the kids at school were asking me weird questions, she said, dumping her backpack by the door. What kind of questions? Like, do you follow the rules at home? And do you tell your mom when you see things you're not supposed to see? And this one girl, Sarah, she said her parents make her write down everything the neighbors do in a special notebook. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. What did you tell them? I told them we just moved here and I don't know what they're talking about. But Mom, it was weird. They all acted like I was supposed to know about some big secret. That evening, Emma decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear her head. The streets were eerily quiet for a Tuesday evening. No children playing outside, no adults working in their gardens, no sounds coming from any of the houses. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. As she passed the house, directly across from hers, she noticed a woman peeking out from behind her curtains. When their eyes met, the woman quickly stepped back into the shadows. 2 houses down, she saw a man standing at his living room window, apparently watching her walk by. He didn't wave or acknowledge her presence, just watched. By the time Emma returned home, she'd counted at least 6 different neighbors who had been observing her evening stroll. It could have been innocent curiosity about the new resident, but something about the intensity of their attention made her deeply uncomfortable. She was double-checking her front door lock when her phone rang. Emma? This is Carol Henley. I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all. What can I do for you? Well, I wanted to follow up on our conversation this morning. Have you had a chance to think about joining the Standards Committee? Emma hesitated. I'm still getting settled in. Maybe we could discuss it at the next community meeting. There was a pause before Carol responded. Of course. But Emma, I should mention that the committee meets tomorrow evening to discuss a rather urgent matter. We'd really value your input. What kind of urgent matter? Oh, just some compliance issues with one of our residents. Nothing you need to worry about. But your fresh perspective could be helpful. Emma found herself agreeing to attend, though She wasn't sure why. Something about Carol's tone made it seem less like an invitation and more like a summons. The next evening, Emma arrived at the community center to find 23 residents seated in folding chairs arranged in concentric circles. Carol stood at a podium in the center, consulting a thick file folder. "Thank you all for coming," Carol began. "Tonight we need to address a serious violation of community standards by the Henderson family at 52 Maple Street." Emma knew the Hendersons. Slightly. They were a young couple with a toddler who had moved in about 6 months ago. She'd seen them working in their garden and thought they seemed like pleasant neighbors. "As you all know," Carol continued, "the Hendersons have repeatedly failed to maintain their property according to our standards. Their grass is consistently half an inch taller than regulations allow. They've planted unauthorized flowers in their front garden. And most seriously, they've been parking their 10-year-old Honda in the driveway despite our clear policy about vehicle age limits." Bob raised his hand. "Have they been fined?" "Multiple times. They've paid the fines but continued the violations. They seem to think they can simply pay for the privilege of ignoring our community standards." "What do you propose we do?" asked Patricia. Carol's smile took on a sharp edge. "I think it's time for a more direct approach. We need to help the Hendersons understand that their behavior affects the entire community." Emma listened with growing horror as the group discussed their plans for the Henderson family. They would file noise complaints with the police based on fabricated evidence. They would report the family to child services, claiming neglect based on the unsafe condition of their property. They would organize a social boycott, ensuring the Hendersons were excluded from all community activities and interactions. "The goal," Carol explained, "is to help them realize that they'd be happier living somewhere more suited to their lifestyle." "You mean you want to drive them out of the neighborhood?" Emma said, unable to stay quiet any longer. The room fell silent. Every face turned toward her, and Emma realized she'd made a serious mistake by speaking up. "Emma," Carol said carefully, "I understand this might seem harsh to someone new to our community, but you have to understand, we've worked very hard to create something special here. We can't allow a few selfish individuals to destroy what we've built. But they're just living their lives. So what if their grass is a little long? Who cares what car they drive?" "We all care," said Frank firmly. "Property values matter. Community standards matter. If we let one family ignore the rules, soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want." Patricia nodded vigorously. "It's about respect, Emma. Respect for your neighbors and the community you've chosen to join." Emma looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. She saw determination, righteousness, and something that looked disturbingly like hunger. These people weren't just enforcing rules, they were feeding on power and control. "What if I don't agree with this?" she asked quietly. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Carol answered. "Well, Emma, that would be unfortunate. You see, community decisions require unanimous support. We can't have residents undermining the group's judgment. And if I refuse to participate?" Carol's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold. "Then I suppose we'd have to consider whether you're really a good fit for our neighborhood after all." Emma understood the threat. Comply, or become the next target. As the meeting continued, she sat in stunned silence while the group planned their campaign against the Henderson family. They discussed surveillance schedules, coordinated complaint strategies, and ways to isolate the family socially. It was psychological warfare disguised as community standards. When the meeting finally ended, Emma walked home in a daze. She now understood why the previous residents had left so suddenly, why houses on Maple Street stayed on the market for months before selling, and why everyone who remained seemed to move in perfect lockstep with Carol's vision of community perfection. She also understood that she and Maya were now trapped. They'd used their entire savings for the down payment on the house. Emma had already started her job at the school. Maya was making friends. They couldn't just pack up and leave, not without losing everything they'd invested in starting over. That night, Emma lay awake wondering what she'd gotten herself and her daughter into. Outside her window, she could see the soft glow of streetlights and the dark shapes of houses where her neighbors slept peacefully, content in their perfectly controlled world. She thought about the Henderson family and wondered how long they had before the community's campaign drove them away. She thought about Maya and how long it would be before her daughter was expected to participate in the neighborhood's system of surveillance and control. Most of all, she thought about what choice she really had: join them or become their next target. By morning, Emma had made her decision. She would play along, at least for now. She would smile and nod and pretend to embrace their twisted version of community spirit. And she would look for a way out, for herself and for any other family that found themselves trapped in the nightmare of Willowbrook's perfect neighborhood, because she was beginning to understand that some things were worse than being alone. Sometimes, the most dangerous monsters were the ones who welcomed you with covered dishes and warm smiles. Story 3. The Patron Saint. The brass bell above Finnegan's books chimed as Detective Lisa Chen pushed through the heavy oak door, stepping from the sweltering August heat into the shop's dim, musty interior. She'd been putting off this visit for 3 days, but the missing persons case had officially gone cold, and she was running out of leads. Blackwater Falls was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, population 3,847 according to the weathered sign at the city limits. In her 5 years working as the town's only detective, Lisa had dealt with plenty of missing persons cases, but they usually involved teenagers running off to the city or bitter custody disputes. Never anything like this. 3 people had vanished in the past 2 months, all under similar circumstances. All were newcomers to town: a traveling salesman, a young woman interviewing for a teaching position, and a college student doing research for his thesis on small-town economics. All had been seen entering Finnegan's books. None had been seen leaving. The shop's owner, Margaret Finnegan, was a local institution. The 67-year-old widow had run the bookstore for 43 years, inheriting it from her late husband's family. She was involved in every aspect of community life: the library board, the historical society, the annual Founders' Day festival. If something was happening in Blackwater Falls, Margaret Finnegan either knew about it or was organizing it herself. Detective Chen! Margaret emerged from behind a towering shelf of leather-bound classics, her silver hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. What a pleasant surprise. Are you finally ready to take my recommendation on that mystery series I mentioned? Lisa forced a smile. Margaret had been trying to get her to read some obscure British detective novels for months. Actually, I'm here. On business, Mrs. Finnegan. I wanted to ask you about some visitors to your shop. Of course, dear. Always happy to help our local law enforcement. Margaret gestured toward a small seating area near the back of the shop. Why don't we sit? I'll put the kettle on. The bookstore was larger than it appeared from the street, with narrow aisles winding between floor-to-ceiling shelves. The air smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and something else Lisa couldn't quite identify. Something sweet and cloying that made her vaguely nauseous. As Margaret bustled around preparing tea, Lisa studied the shop more carefully. She'd been here dozens of times over the years, but always as a customer, never with a detective's eye. Now she noticed things that seemed odd: the way the aisles created dead ends and blind corners, the lack of security cameras or mirrors, the heavy curtains that blocked most of the natural light from the windows. Here we are, Margaret said, returning with a China tea service. Earl Grey. I hope that's all right. Mrs. Finnegan, I need to ask you about 3 recent visitors to your shop. Lisa pulled out her notebook. David Kowalski, the salesman from Detroit. He was seen entering your store on June 15th around 2 p.m. Margaret poured tea with steady hands. Oh yes, I remember David. Lovely young man. He was looking for local history books. Said he liked to learn about the places he visited for business. Did he purchase anything? I believe so. Let me check. My records. Margaret moved to an old-fashioned register that looked like it belonged in a museum. Yes, here it is. He bought a copy of The Founding of Blackwater Falls and a collection of local folklore. How long did he stay? Oh, I couldn't say exactly. You know how it is with book lovers. They lose track of time. He was browsing quite contentedly when I went to the back room to process some new inventory. Lisa made notes. And when you came back, he was gone. Left his money on the counter. Exact change. Very considerate. Mrs. Finnegan, Mr. Kowalski never checked out of his hotel. His car was found in your parking lot 3 days later. Margaret's hand paused for just a moment as she lifted her teacup. How strange. Perhaps he found another way to continue his journey? You know how these traveling salesmen are, always changing their plans. Lisa asked about the other 2 missing persons, receiving similar responses. Margaret remembered them both fondly, claimed they'd purchased books and left during times when she was occupied elsewhere. She seemed genuinely puzzled by their disappearances. Mrs. Finnegan, I'd like to take a look around the shop if you don't mind. Of course not, dear, though I'm not sure what you're hoping to find. Lisa spent the next hour methodically searching the bookstore. She found nothing obviously suspicious, no signs of struggle, no hidden rooms or passages, no indication that anything violent had occurred. But the feeling of unease that had been growing since she entered the shop only intensified. It was when she was examining the back room that she noticed the trap door. It was well disguised, cut into the wooden floor and covered with a thin Persian rug. Lisa might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been looking for loose floorboards. The hinges were well oiled and silent. Mrs. Finnegan? Lisa called. The older woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Find something interesting? What's down here? Lisa indicated the trap door. Oh, that's just the old root cellar. The building dates back to 1892. They used to store vegetables and preserves down there. I haven't opened it in years. The stairs are probably rotted through by now. Lisa knelt and grasped the heavy iron ring that served as a handle. The trapdoor opened easily, revealing a set of stone steps that descended into darkness. A wave of that sweet, cloying smell rose from below, now strong enough to make Lisa's eyes water. I'd like to take a look. Detective, I really don't think that's safe. As I said, the structure is quite old. Lisa was already pulling out her flashlight and starting down the steps. I'll be careful. The stone stairs were worn smooth by decades of use, but they seemed solid enough. As Lisa descended, her flashlight beam revealed that the basement was much larger than a simple root cellar. Stone archways led off in multiple directions, creating a maze of interconnected chambers. Mrs. Finnegan, Lisa called up. This is quite extensive for a root cellar. There was no response. Lisa continued exploring, her unease growing with each step. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, making her dizzy and nauseous. She followed one of the passages and found herself in a larger chamber, filled with what appeared to be storage alcoves carved into the walls. Her flashlight beam played over the alcoves, and Lisa's blood turned to ice. They weren't empty. Each alcove contained a person standing upright with their eyes closed and their hands folded across their chests. Their skin had a waxy, preserved appearance, and they were perfectly still. No breathing, no movement of any kind. But they looked fresh, as if they'd been placed there recently. Lisa recognized David Kowalski immediately. He was exactly as he'd appeared in the missing person report. A man in his 30s wearing a rumpled business suit. In the alcove next to him stood Jennifer Walsh, the teacher candidate, still wearing the conservative dress she'd chosen for her interview. And there, in the third alcove, was Kevin Murphy, the college student, his backpack still strapped to his shoulders. They were all perfectly preserved, like figures in a wax museum. But as Lisa stepped closer, she could see the slight rise and fall of their chests. They were breathing, barely, but breathing. Magnificent, aren't they? Lisa spun around to find Margaret Finnegan standing at the entrance to the chamber. The kindly bookstore owner was gone, replaced by something altogether more sinister. Margaret's eyes held a cold intelligence, and her grandmotherly smile had become predatory. Mrs. Finnegan, what is this place? This is my collection, dear. My life's work. Margaret moved closer, and Lisa noticed she was holding something. A small ceramic incense burner from which sweet-smelling smoke was rising. Each one represents hours of careful selection and preparation. Lisa's hand moved toward her service weapon, but her movements felt sluggish. The sweet smoke was affecting her coordination and thinking. What have you done to them? I've preserved them, detective, given them eternal peace and purpose. They're part of something greater now. guardians of this town's most precious secrets. Lisa tried to back away, but her legs weren't responding properly. The smoke from Margaret's incense burner was making everything fuzzy and dreamlike. You see, Detective, Blackwater Falls has been my family's responsibility for over a century. My great-grandfather founded this town, and my family has protected it ever since. But protection requires sacrifice. Margaret was circling Lisa now, like a predator studying its prey. Every few years, the town needs sustenance, fresh life force to maintain the barriers that keep the outside world from corrupting our perfect little community. You're insane, Lisa managed to whisper. Am I? Look around you, Detective. Crime rates in Blackwater Falls are virtually non-zero. Our children don't run away to the cities. Our families stay together. Our elderly live longer and healthier lives than anywhere else in the state. This town is paradise, but paradise requires maintenance. Lisa forced herself to focus through the haze of whatever drug Margaret was using. These people, they're still alive. Of course they are. Their life force feeds the town's spiritual defenses, but they're completely at peace. No worries, no pain, no fear. They've found their purpose as guardians of our community. People will come looking for me. Margaret laughed softly. Oh, my dear detective, who do you think will look? The mayor, who's been one of my closest friends for 30 years? The sheriff, whose family has worked with mine for 3 generations? The town council, half of whom owe their positions to my family's influence? Lisa's vision was growing dim, but she could see Margaret pulling out a 4th alcove, this one clearly prepared for a new occupant. The beautiful thing about small towns, Margaret continued, is that everyone understands the importance of tradition. Everyone knows that some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. Your disappearance will be regrettable, but it won't be questioned. With her last bit of strength, Lisa lunged for her radio, hoping to call for backup. But Margaret was faster, striking Lisa's wrist with surprising force and sending the radio clattering across the stone floor. There's no shame in this, Detective. You should be honored. You'll be joining a distinguished group of guardians, and your sacrifice will protect this town for another decade. As the sweet smoke overwhelmed her senses, Lisa felt herself being guided toward the waiting alcove. Her last coherent thought was a desperate hope that someone, somehow, would come looking for her. But as consciousness faded, she could hear Margaret, humming softly, a lullaby that sounded like it belonged to another century, when the town was young and its first guardians were chosen. Sleep now, Detective. Your duty to Blackwater Falls is just beginning. Lisa's eyes closed, and she joined the silent vigil of the preserved guardians, watching over a town that had learned to survive by feeding on strangers who would never be missed by anyone who mattered. Above them, Margaret Finnegan returned to her bookstore, turned the sign to open, and waited for the next traveler who would be drawn by the promise of local history and small-town charm. After all, the town would need feeding again soon. Story 4. The Harvest Queen. The ancient elm trees that lined Millbrook's Main Street had just begun their autumn transformation when Sarah McKinnon first heard about the Harvest Festival. She'd moved to the small town in late August, drawn by a teaching position at the local high school and the promise of a quieter life after years in Chicago's public school system. "Oh, you absolutely must participate in the festival," gushed Helen Morrison, the school's secretary, as she handed Sarah an ornate flyer during her second week on the job. "It's been a tradition here for over 150 years. The whole town gets involved." Sarah studied the flyer, which was decorated with intricate woodcut-style illustrations of corn stalks, pumpkins, and sheaves of wheat. At the center was an elaborate drawing of a young woman wearing a crown made of autumn leaves and holding a wicker basket overflowing with harvest vegetables. "The Harvest Queen," Helen explained, noticing Sarah's focus on the central image. "Every year we choose one unmarried woman between the ages of 18 and 35 to serve as the festival's centerpiece. It's quite an honor." "What exactly does the Harvest Queen do?" Helen's smile seemed to flicker for just a moment. "Oh, she presides over the festivities, of course, leads the parade, judges the contests, that sort of thing. It's mostly ceremonial." Over the next few weeks, Sarah heard more and more about the upcoming festival. Students in her English classes wrote essays about family traditions connected to the celebration. Local businesses decorated their windows with harvest themes. The entire town seemed to buzz with excitement and anticipation. What struck Sarah as odd was how many people mentioned that she would be perfect for the role of Harvest Queen. "You're exactly the right age," said Tom Bradley, who owned the local grocery store. "And new to town, that's always good luck for the harvest." "New blood brings fresh energy to the celebration," agreed Dr. Patricia Vance, the town's only physician. "We've been hoping someone like you would come along." Even her students seemed unusually interested in whether she would participate. "Miss McKinnon, you should totally be the Harvest Queen," said Jessica, one of her bright 17-year-old students. "It would be so cool to have our English teacher in the festival." "What exactly would I have to do?" Sarah asked. Jessica exchanged glances with her classmates before answering. "Well, there's the crowning ceremony on Friday night, then the parade on Saturday, and then..." She trailed off, looking uncertain. "Then what?" "The finale," said another student, Marcus. "But that's just for the Queen and the town elders. It's like a private ceremony or something." As October progressed, the pressure for Sarah to participate intensified. She found beautifully crafted invitations in her mailbox, on her desk at school, and even tucked under her windshield wipers. Each one featured the same elegant calligraphy. "The citizens of Millbrook cordially invite Sarah McKinnon to accept the honor of serving as this year's Harvest Queen." "I'm really flattered," Sarah told Helen Morrison after finding the 5th invitation in her classroom. "But I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I'm new here, and I don't really know the traditions." "That's exactly why you're perfect," Helen interrupted. "The Harvest Queen represents renewal and fresh beginnings. Besides, there aren't many eligible candidates this year." "What do you mean?" Helen seemed to choose her words carefully. "Well, most of the young women in town are either married or no longer eligible for other reasons." Sarah was about to ask what those other reasons might be when Principal Davidson knocked on the classroom door. "Sarah, could I speak with you for a moment?" Principal Davidson was a man in his 60s who had been running Millbrook High for over 20 years. He was universally respected in the community and had been nothing but supportive since Sarah's arrival. "I understand you've been invited to serve as Harvest Queen," he said, settling into one of the student desks. "I hope you'll consider accepting. Mr. Davidson, I appreciate the honor, but I'm just not sure." "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. This town has been very good to you. Good job, good salary, excellent benefits, a supportive community. Sometimes we all have to give back to the places that welcome us." There was something in his tone that made Sarah uncomfortable. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. "Are you saying my job depends on participating in this festival?" "Of course not," he said quickly. "I'm just saying that community involvement is appreciated. The school board values teachers who embrace local traditions." That evening, Sarah called her sister in Chicago to talk through her confusion. "It sounds like a charming small-town thing," her sister said. "What's the big deal? You dress up, wave from a float, and make nice with the locals. It could be fun." "There's something they're not telling me, Karen. Everyone acts like it's this amazing honor, but they're all vague about what actually happens during the finale ceremony." "Have you tried asking directly?" "I've tried, but I keep getting non-answers. And there's something else weird. I went to the library to research the festival's history, and there are hardly any records. A few newspaper clippings from the 1950s and 60s, but nothing recent, and nothing that explains what the Harvest Queen actually does. Maybe it's just lost to time. Small towns aren't always great at record keeping, but Sarah's intuition was telling her something different. The next day, she decided to do some investigation of her own. She started by visiting Millbrook's small historical society, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on the edge of town. The elderly volunteer who manned the front desk, Mrs. Abernathy, seemed nervous when Sarah asked about Harvest Queen records. "Oh, we don't really keep detailed records of the festival," she said, fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "It's more of a lived tradition, if you know what I mean. But surely there are photographs, programs from previous years, something?" Mrs. Abernathy disappeared into the back room for several minutes before returning with a single photograph album. This is all we have, I'm afraid. The album contained black and white photographs spanning what appeared to be several decades. Sarah flipped through images of parades, corn mazes, pie-eating contests, and other typical small-town festival activities. But she noticed something troubling. While there were plenty of photos of harvest queens being crowned and participating, in parades there were no pictures of what happened afterward. More unsettling was the fact that she recognized none of the harvest queens from around town. In a community of only 4,200 people, she should have encountered at least some of these women during her weeks in Millbrook. Mrs. Abernathy, what happened to the women in these photos? The harvest queens? The older woman's face went pale. Well, that is, many of them moved away after the festival. Young people, you know, they get restless in small towns. All of them moved away? I really couldn't say, dear. I'm not the one to ask about such things. That night, Sarah drove to the town cemetery. If the harvest queens had died rather than moved away, there might be some record of it. She walked among the headstones with a flashlight, looking for names that matched the ones she'd seen in the Historical Society's album. What she found chilled her to the bone. There were indeed graves for several of the former harvest queens, but their death dates were all within a year of their festival service. Young women in their 20s and 30s, all dying of various causes, accidents, sudden illnesses, mysterious circumstances. Sarah sat on a cemetery bench, trying to process what she'd discovered. Was it possible that serving as harvest queen was somehow dangerous? Or was she letting her imagination run wild? Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The corn is ready. The queen must come home. Sarah's hands shook as she stared at the cryptic message. She looked around the cemetery, suddenly aware of how isolated and vulnerable she was. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, and every shadow seemed to hold menace. She hurried back to her car and drove home, locking her doors and closing all the curtains. But sleep was impossible. She kept thinking about the photographs, the graves, and the strange intensity with which the entire town seemed focused on making her their harvest queen. The next morning brought a new development. When Sarah arrived at school, she found her classroom filled with gift baskets, dozens of them covering every surface. Each basket contained autumn treats, handmade crafts, and notes expressing excitement about her inevitable acceptance of the harvest queen role. "The whole town is talking about it," Helen Morrison said when Sarah tracked her down in the main office. "Everyone's so excited to have you represent us. Helen, I need to ask you something directly. What really happens during the ceremony?" Helen's cheerful expression faltered. Well, it's different every year. Traditional things. Community bonding, that's not an answer." For a moment, Helen looked genuinely frightened. Then she glanced around to make sure they were alone and leaned closer. "Sarah, some traditions are bigger than any individual person. This town has prospered for a century and a half because we honor the old ways. The harvest fails in some places, but never here. Our children grow up healthy and strong. Our elderly live longer than anywhere else in the state. That doesn't happen by accident." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that sometimes we all have to make sacrifices for the greater good. And sometimes those sacrifices are chosen for us." Sarah felt ice water in her veins. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to help you understand. The festival is in 3 days. The queen has already been chosen. Fighting it will only make things unpleasant." That afternoon, Sarah called in sick and drove to the nearest city, 60 miles away. She needed distance from Millbrook to think clearly and plan her next move. She checked into a modest hotel and spent the evening researching the town's history online. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Buried in old newspaper archives and genealogy websites, she discovered a pattern going back generations. Young women who served as harvest queen either died within a year of the festival or disappeared entirely. The town's agricultural success was legendary. Crops that thrived when neighboring areas suffered drought or blight, livestock that was remarkably healthy and productive, families that were unusually prosperous. It was as if Millbrook had made some kind of bargain, trading the lives of young women for continued prosperity. Sarah's phone rang constantly throughout the evening. Calls from Helen Morrison, Principal Davidson, Dr. Vance, and numbers she didn't recognize. She let them all go to voicemail. When she finally listened to the messages, they started friendly, but became increasingly urgent and threatening. Sarah, this is Tom Bradley. We're all worried about you. Please come home. Sarah, it's Dr. Vance. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown. You need to come back so we can help you. Miss McKinnon, this is Principal Davidson. Your absence today was unexcused. We need to discuss your future at the school. The final message was from a voice she didn't recognize. Elderly, male, and somehow carrying an authority that made her skin crawl. Miss McKinnon, this is Edgar Thorne, chairman of the town council. You have been chosen for a great honor, and the entire community is depending on you. The festival begins tomorrow, and your presence is required. Come home, child. Come home, where you belong. Sarah sat in her hotel room, staring out at the city lights and trying to decide what to do. She could run, pack up her things, forfeit her security deposit, and find a new job in a new town. But she'd already invested so much in building a life in Millbrook, and part of her wondered if she was overreacting to what might be innocent. Small-town weirdness. Her phone buzzed with another text. The children are asking for their teacher. Don't let them down. That message was accompanied by a photo of her students holding a banner that read, "We love Miss McKinnon, our harvest." Queen. Sarah's heart broke looking at their innocent faces. These kids had nothing to do with whatever dark tradition their town practiced. If she ran, she'd be abandoning them to the same system that had apparently been claiming young women for generations. But if she went back, she might be walking into her own death. As she sat in the darkness, weighing her impossible choices, Sarah realized that whatever happened next, she wasn't going to face it passively. If Millbrook wanted her as their harvest queen, she would give them a queen they hadn't bargained for. She spent the rest of the night preparing. Sarah drove back to Millbrook the next morning, arriving just as the festival was beginning. Main Street was decorated with banners and bunting, and the smell of caramel apples and funnel cakes filled the air. Children ran between the vendor booths while their parents set up for the various contests and displays. It looked like any charming small-town celebration, but Sarah now saw the darker undertones. The way conversation stopped when she appeared, the relief in people's faces when they realized she'd returned, the subtle positioning of certain townspeople to ensure she couldn't leave again. Sarah. Helen Morrison appeared at her side almost instantly. Thank goodness you're back. We were so worried. I'm here, Sarah said simply. Wonderful. The crowning ceremony is at sunset. You'll want to get ready. The dress is waiting for you at the community center. The Harvest Queen dress was beautiful, a flowing gown in shades of gold and amber, embroidered with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. As Sarah put it on, she noticed that it fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her measurements. You look radiant, said Dr. Vance, who had appeared to help with final preparations. Absolutely perfect. As the sun began to set, Sarah was led to a stage that had been erected in the town square. The entire population of Millbrook seemed to be gathered, their faces lit by torches and lanterns. Children sat cross-legged on blankets while adults stood in concentric circles around the stage. Edgar Thorne, the elderly man whose voice she'd heard on the phone, approached the microphone. He was ancient, probably in his 80s, but his voice carried clearly across the crowd. Citizens of Millbrook, we gather tonight as our forebears have gathered for over a century and a half, to honor the harvest and ensure our continued prosperity.
This year we are blessed to welcome Sarah McKinnon as our queen. The crowd erupted in cheers as Sarah was fitted with a crown made of autumn leaves and given a ceremonial basket of harvest vegetables.
She smiled and waved, playing her part while scanning the crowd for any possible escape route. Tomorrow, our queen will lead the harvest parade, Edgar continued. And tomorrow night, she will participate in the sacred finale that binds our community to the ancient powers that ensure our success. More cheers, but Sarah noticed that not everyone in the crowd looked celebratory. Some of the townspeople, particularly those who appeared to be her age, looked sick with guilt or fear. They knew what was coming. The ceremony continued with traditional songs and dances, but Sarah barely heard any of it. She was focused on the faces in the crowd, trying to identify allies and enemies. Most concerning were the men positioned around the perimeter of the gathering, clearly security to ensure she didn't bolt. When the evening finally ended, Sarah was escorted to a guest room above the community center. Dr. Vance explained that it was tradition for the Harvest Queen to spend the night in ceremonial isolation before the parade. What she didn't explain was that the door would be locked from the outside. Sarah waited until she was sure the building was empty, then began searching for a way out. The window was too high to jump from safely, and the door was solid oak with a heavy deadbolt. But the room had a ventilation grate that led to the building's heating system. Sarah had always been small and athletic. She managed to remove the grate cover and squeeze into the ductwork, following the metal passages until she found an exit in the basement. From there, she was able to slip out through a cellar door. The town was quiet, everyone apparently asleep after the evening's festivities. Sarah made her way carefully through the back streets to her own house, where she retrieved her laptop and some supplies she'd hidden earlier. She spent the remaining hours of darkness setting her plan in motion. The next morning, the town woke to find their Harvest Queen missing. Panic spread quickly through the streets as search parties formed and suspicious glances were exchanged. By the time Sarah reappeared at the town square for the parade, the entire population was in an uproar. "There. She is!" someone shouted. But Sarah wasn't alone. She was accompanied by 24 state police officers and a team from the FBI's organized crime unit. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Agent Patricia Lopez, "this town is now under federal investigation for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. No one is to leave until we've completed our interviews." Sarah had spent the night in the next county, using her laptop to compile everything she'd discovered about Millbrook's dark history. Her research had been enough to convince federal authorities that something deeply criminal was happening in the town. As the investigation unfolded over the following weeks, the truth finally emerged. For over a century, Millbrook's leadership had been maintaining a systematic murder cult disguised as a harvest festival. Young women were ritually killed during the finale ceremony, their blood used to fertilize the town's crops in a perverse ritual that the leadership genuinely believed ensured agricultural success. The practice had been passed down through generations of families, with most townspeople either actively participating or too frightened to speak out. The consistent prosperity of Millbrook's farms was due not to supernatural intervention, but to careful agricultural practices funded by money stolen from the victims' bank accounts and life insurance policies. Edgar Thorne and 17 other town leaders were eventually convicted of multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. Dozens more residents were charged with accessory crimes or obstruction of justice. Sarah never returned to teach in Millbrook. She testified at the trials and then moved across the country hoping to put the nightmare behind her. But she never forgot the lesson she'd learned about the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect communities. And every autumn, when she saw decorations celebrating the harvest season, she remembered the price that some small towns were willing to pay for their prosperity and the young women who had paid it for them. Story 5. The founding families. Rebecca Walsh first noticed the portraits on her third day in Thornwood. She'd been hired as the new town librarian, a position that had apparently been vacant for over 6 months and was still getting oriented to both the job and the community. The library was housed in a grand Victorian building that had clearly been someone's mansion in a previous century, and the walls were lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men and women in period dress. "The founding families," explained Marjorie Westbrook, the outgoing interim librarian, when Rebecca asked about the portraits. "The Thornwoods, the Blackbournes, the Ashfords, and the Greys. Their descendants still run pretty much everything in town." Rebecca studied the paintings more closely. The subjects all shared certain features: sharp cheekbones, penetrating dark eyes, and expressions that seemed to convey both intelligence and cruelty. Even the women and children in the portraits had a predatory quality that made Rebecca uncomfortable. "Was Thornwood founded?" she asked. 1847, Marjorie replied. "The 4 families came here together from somewhere back east, founded the town as a kind of utopian community, though I'm not sure it worked out quite the way they planned." Over the following weeks, Rebecca learned more about Thornwood's founding families and their continued influence. Mayor Jonathan Thornwood was a direct descendant of the town's primary founder. Police Chief Margaret Blackburn traced her lineage back to the family that had established the first law enforcement. Dr. Samuel Ashford ran the medical clinic that his great-great-grandfather had built, and Eleanor Gray owned the bank that had been in her family for 5 generations. What struck Rebecca as odd was how the descendants had inherited not just their ancestors' businesses and positions, but also their physical appearance. Jonathan Thornwood could have been a clone of the man in the library's central portrait. Margaret Blackburn had the same severe features as the woman depicted in the 1847 oil painting. It was as if the founding families had somehow avoided the genetic mixing that usually occurred over several generations. Rebecca's unease deepened when she began digitizing the library's historical records. The town's documentation was remarkably complete for a small community. Detailed census records, property deeds, birth and death certificates going back to the founding. But as she worked through the files, patterns emerged that made no sense. The founding family's longevity was extraordinary. According to the records, people with surnames Thornwood, Blackburn, Ashford, and Gray routinely lived well into their 90s, or even past 100, even in the 19th century when such lifespans were virtually unheard of. Meanwhile, members of other families, the common residents of Thornwood, seemed to die much younger, often of causes listed vaguely as wasting sickness or sudden decline. More disturbing were the patterns of disappearances. Every few years, throughout Thornwood's history, families would simply vanish from the records. The Kowalski family, listed in the 1923 census with 4 children, had no further documentation after 1924. The Martinez family appeared in records through 1956, then disappeared entirely. The pattern repeated dozens of times over the decades. "Marjorie," Rebecca asked during one of the older woman's visits to help with the transition, "what happened to all the families that used to live here? The records show Thornwood used to have a much larger population." Marjorie's face went pale. "Oh, families come and go in small towns. People move away for better opportunities. But there are no records of them moving. No forwarding addresses. No transfer of property ownership. They just stop existing in the documentation. Well, record keeping wasn't always as thorough as it is now." But Rebecca could see the fear in Marjorie's eyes. The older woman knew something she wasn't saying. That evening, Rebecca decided to visit the town cemetery to see if the missing families had died rather than moved away. The Thornwood Memorial Cemetery was located on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by an ornate iron fence that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel. The oldest section of the cemetery contained elaborate monuments to the founding families, towering angels, ornate mausoleums, and headstones carved from expensive marble. But scattered among these grand memorials were smaller, simpler graves, marking the deaths of people with surnames that matched Rebecca's missing families. What chilled her was the pattern of death dates. Entire families appeared to have died within days or weeks of each other, often with no apparent cause listed on their headstones. The Kowalski family, father, mother, and 4 children, all died in March 1924. The Martinez family perished together in October 1956. The pattern repeated throughout the cemetery's history. Rebecca was photographing some of the headstones when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find a man in his 60s watching her from a few yards away. He was tall and gaunt, with the sharp features she'd begun to associate with Thornwood's founding families. "Miss Walsh, isn't it? I'm Dr. Samuel Ashford. Dr. Ashford. I was just doing some historical research." "Of course. Very admirable. We don't get many people interested in local history." His smile was friendly, but his dark eyes remained cold. "Find anything interesting?" "Just trying to understand some gaps in the historical record. Families that seem to disappear from documentation." "Ah. Well, record keeping in the 19th and early 20th centuries was rather haphazard. Many families probably moved away without any formal paperwork. But what about the families buried here? Entire families dying at the same time?" Dr. Ashford's expression didn't change, but Rebecca sensed a shift in his demeanor. Disease could be quite devastating in those days. Influenza, consumption, various epidemics. It wasn't uncommon for illnesses to sweep through entire households. Rebecca nodded politely, but she'd read enough historical records to know that even epidemic diseases rarely killed every member of large families simultaneously. "Well, I should let you get back to your research," Dr. Ashford said. "But Miss Walsh, a word of advice? Some historical mysteries are better left unsolved. Small towns can be sensitive about their past." After he left, Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. She quickly finished her photography and hurried back to town, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the library to find Mayor Thornwood waiting for her. "Miss Walsh, I understand you've been doing research into our town's history." Jonathan Thornwood was a man in his 50s, but he looked exactly like the founder depicted in the library's central portrait. The same angular face, the same penetrating dark eyes, even the same aristocratic bearing. Standing next to the painting, the resemblance was uncanny. "Yes, I'm digitizing the historical records. It's part of modernizing the library's archives." "Commendable work. But I've heard you've been asking questions about certain inconsistencies in the records." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. "I've noticed some gaps in documentation, yes. Miss Walsh, I'm going to be direct with you. Thornwood is a community that values privacy and tradition. We've thrived for over a century and a half by minding our own business and expecting others to do the same. I hope you understand the wisdom in that approach. Are you asking me to stop my research? I'm asking you to focus on your job duties as librarian. Manage the collection, help patrons find books, organize community events. Leave the historical interpretation to those of us whose families have been here since the beginning." There was no mistaking the threat in his tone. Rebecca nodded and mumbled something about understanding her role, but internally she was more determined than ever to discover the truth about Thornwood's founding families. That afternoon, she used her lunch break to visit the one person in town who might give her honest answers. Father Michael O'Brien, the elderly priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church. O'Brien was in his 70s and had served the Thornwood parish for over 40 years. If anyone knew the town's secrets, it would be him. She found him in the church garden, tending to late-season vegetables. "Father O'Brien, I'm Rebecca Walsh, the new librarian." "Ah, Miss Walsh, I've heard about you. How are you settling in?" "Well, actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been researching the town's history, and I've found some things that don't make sense." Father O'Brien's hands stilled on the tomato plant he'd been pruning. "What sort of things?" Rebecca told him about the missing families, the unusual death patterns, and the founding family's extraordinary longevity. As she spoke, the priest's face grew increasingly troubled. "Father, do you know what happened to all those families?" For a long moment, Father O'Brien was silent. Then he sat down, his pruning shears, and looked directly at her. "Child, what I'm about to tell you must never be repeated. And after I tell you, you need to leave Thornwood as quickly as possible." Rebecca's blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" "The founding families of Thornwood didn't come here to establish a utopian community. They came here to escape persecution for practicing, let's call it an alternative form of spirituality." "You mean they were witches?" "Something far worse than witches, I'm afraid. They were practitioners of a form of magic that requires blood sacrifice to maintain. Specifically, the blood of entire family lines." Rebecca sank onto a nearby garden bench. "That's impossible." "Is it? You've seen the evidence yourself. Every few years a family disappears from Thornwood. Always families with children, always bloodlines that can be completely eradicated. The founding families feed on this sacrifice. It's what gives them their longevity, their prosperity, their continued power. But how could this go on for over a century? How could no one stop it?" "Who would stop it? The mayor, the police chief, the doctor, the banker. They're all part of the same cursed bloodline." "And the federal authorities?" "Well, Thornwood is very good at making families disappear without a trace. No bodies, no evidence, no witnesses." Father O'Brien leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The families don't just die, Miss Walsh. They're consumed, body and soul. Their life force is what keeps the founding families young and powerful. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent 40 years watching good families vanish while being powerless to stop it. The founding families tolerate my presence because even devil worshippers sometimes want the comfort of conventional religion. But I've been documenting their crimes, hoping that someday someone would come along who could expose them. Why me? Because you're asking the right questions. And because he hesitated. Because I think they're planning to make you and any family you might start their next sacrifice. Rebecca's head spun. That's insane. I don't have a family. I'm single. But you're young, healthy, and from outside the community. They probably expect you to eventually marry and have children, a new bloodline to harvest, as if summoned by their conversation. Police Chief Margaret Blackburn appeared at the garden gate. Like the other founding family descendants, she was a perfect replica of her ancestors' portrait, tall, severe, with those penetrating dark eyes. Father O'Brien. Miss Walsh, having a nice chat? Just discussing parish business, Father O'Brien said evenly. Of course. Chief Blackburn's smile was predatory. Miss Walsh, I hope you're finding our town accommodating. Very much so. Excellent. You know, we're always looking for ways to help newcomers feel welcome. Perhaps you'd like to join us for dinner sometime? The founding families have a tradition of monthly gatherings. Very intimate, very traditional. Rebecca forced herself to smile. That sounds lovely. Wonderful. This Saturday, 7 o'clock, Mayor Thornwood's house. It's the large Victorian on Elm Street. You can't miss it. After Chief Blackburn left, Father O'Brien grabbed Rebecca's arm. You cannot go to that dinner. Why not? Because that's how it starts. They'll wine and dine you, make you feel special, chosen. They'll probably even introduce you to some eligible bachelor from one of their bloodlines. But it's all part of the process. They're evaluating you as breeding stock. Rebecca felt sick. What should I do? Leave. Tonight. Don't go back to your apartment. Don't pack your things. Don't tell anyone you're going. Just drive away and never come back. But my job, my life. Miss Walsh, your life won't be worth living if you stay. And if you do, eventually start a family here, those children will be marked for death from the moment they're born. That evening, Rebecca sat in her small apartment trying to decide what to do. Everything Father O'Brien had told her sounded like fantasy, but the evidence she'd uncovered was hard to deny. The missing families, the death patterns, the founding family's unnatural longevity, it all pointed to something deeply wrong with Thornwood. Her phone rang. Mayor Thornwood. Miss Walsh, I wanted to personally confirm that you'll be joining us for dinner on Saturday. The other founding families are quite eager to meet you. Of course, I'm looking forward to it. Excellent. And Miss Walsh, I hope you'll consider making Thornwood your permanent home. We think you'd fit in very well here. After hanging up, Rebecca made her decision. She packed a single bag with essentials and left everything else behind. At midnight, she quietly loaded her car and drove out of Thornwood, watching the town disappear in her rearview mirror. But she didn't just run. She drove to the FBI field office in the state capital and spent the next 6 hours detailing everything she'd discovered about Thornwood's founding families. She provided copies of the historical records, photographs of the cemetery, and Father O'Brien's contact information. 2 weeks later, federal agents raided Thornwood. What they found in the basements of the founding families' homes shocked even seasoned investigators. Evidence of ritual murder going back generations, preserved remains of hundreds of victims, detailed records of the blood magic practices that the families believed maintained their power. The surviving members of the 4 founding families were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and federal civil rights violations. The trials revealed the full scope of their crimes, over 150 years of systematic murder disguised as a small town's natural population turnover. Father O'Brien testified as a key witness, finally able to break the silence he'd maintained for 4 decades. His detailed documentation helped prosecutors build an airtight case against the cult that had masqueraded as civic leadership. Rebecca never returned to Thornwood, even for the trials. She moved to a large city where she could disappear into anonymity. But she never forgot the lesson she'd learned about the evil that could hide behind the facade of small-town respectability. The town of Thornwood was eventually dissolved as a municipality. The Victorian houses where the founding families had lived were demolished, and the land was turned into a state park. A memorial was erected to honor the victims whose names had been erased from history. But sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings, hikers in the area report seeing lights in the woods where the town used to stand. And occasionally, someone claims to hear voices carried on the wind, the sounds of families calling out for justice that was over a century overdue. And so our journey through America's most sinister small towns comes to an end. Though for the survivors of these stories, the real journey is just beginning. The journey of living with knowledge too terrible to share, of carrying secrets that would destroy the very people you're trying to protect. We've witnessed 5 communities where the promise of safety and belonging became the very trap that ensnared the innocent, where traditions weren't just quaint customs, but feeding rituals for entities both human and otherwise, where the price of admission to paradise was paid not by those who chose to stay, but by those who never had a choice at all. Sarah, who escaped the Harvest Festival but can never truly escape the knowledge of what she left behind. Emma, now vigilant against any community that welcomes her too warmly. Rebecca, forever suspicious of founding families and their pristine historical records. These survivors carry with them a terrible wisdom, that monsters don't always lurk in dark forests or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they serve on town councils, run neighborhood associations, and volunteer at the local library. But perhaps the most chilling truth revealed in these tales is how easily ordinary people can become complicit in unspeakable evil, how fear, tradition, and the promise of prosperity can transform neighbors into predators, how the very human need to belong can be weaponized against those seeking nothing more than a place to call home. The next time you drive through a town where the houses are too perfect, the residents too friendly, and the local traditions just a little too important to miss, remember these stories. Remember that in the darkest corners of America, some communities have learned that the best way to keep their secrets is to ensure that outsiders become part of them, permanently. Sweet dreams, Nightmare Society members. And remember, home is where the heart is, but sometimes it's also where the bodies are buried.